Okay. Okay, sorry about that. Let's get underway. We don't quite have all of our participants. Do we have everyone here? Yes, lots of people entered the waiting room. Okay, thanks very much. Thanks for joining this session on Australian Sciences at ARPS 21. We've got 4 great papers coming towards us, all touching on some aspects of Australian science and technology. I'll start with an acknowledgement of country, and I'd like to acknowledge that I am seated on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations. This conference is being hosted by the University of Wollongong on Dharawal, Yuin and Wadi Wadi lands. And speakers today are coming from the lands of Gadigal and lands of the Guyana, and I believe some people will also be making their own acknowledgements. I wish to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and particularly to acknowledge the ancient and ongoing connection that Indigenous people have had with knowing in this country, particularly relevant to the topics for today. Wherever you are within Australia, you are on Indigenous Australian land, the sovereignty of which was never ceded. So I've already caused us to slip a few minutes behind, so let's just get straight into our first paper from Oliver Hockadel. Oliver is a historian of science and a tenured researcher at the Instituto Miller y Fontenelle for research in the humanities. He has published widely on the history of science popularization and the urban history of science. More recently started to work on a global history of the zoo in the 19th and early 20th centuries. So I'll hand it over to you, Oliver.
Thank you very much, Martin, and good morning to you in Australia. It's deep in the night here in Barcelona. And I'd like to start off with acknowledgements, because as you may imagine, although there are so many resources now available to us historians, it was not easy for me to research this topic, and I'm grateful to a large number of people, and in particular to Brad Gerling, who is the great grandson of August Gerling, the protagonist of my paper. This is about the riddle of the kangaroo birth, and I start off with a quote from Abraham Bartlett, who was at the time the superintendent of the London Zoo. And he writes, well, posthumously, actually, the excitement and curiosity evinced by most persons when they witness the young kangaroo protruding from the mother's pouch naturally leads to the question, how it got there. A question not yet satisfactorily answered. Long have we been trying to unravel the mystery, and some of the ablest naturalists have spent much valuable time with a view to solve it. So this is 1898, and we're going to jump back now to the first third. Oh yeah, well, as Australians, I guess you're aware of how tiny the embryo is of the kangaroo when it's born, and how long it takes to mature within it in the pouch. So that was kind of the riddle at the time. Such a small, tiny creature, how could it get into the pouch? And I'm looking very briefly to give the context for what happens in Australia. I'm looking at what happens first very briefly in Europe and in European zoos. And I'm starting off with the research of Richard Owen, who used kind of the London Zoo to create offspring. Basically, he brought together all the kangaroos and had them observed. And he published 2 papers in 1833 and 1834. And he was the first to kind of put forward this what I call the mother theory, right? He writes, for example, although he says the mother is responsible for moving the embryo. But he phrases this very carefully. He said, "I was led to believe that the mode of removal of the young from the vulva to the pouch was by the mouth of the mother." But he admits it was in the middle of the night. The mode of transmission to the pouch, how it actually got there, was not observed. So there's still kind of this question mark hanging over this issue. Every endeavor will be made to clear up this part of the problem ex visu. He says, and this is kind of an exhortation to other naturalists, and indeed all through the 19th century in other European zoos, naturalists tried to observe the transition from the vulva to the pouch, and actually they never really managed, for various reasons, to observe this. Nevertheless, I looked at a large number of sources, from popular science articles, zoo guides, newspapers, articles, textbooks, encyclopedias, veterinary medicine, and so on and so forth, from a variety of like European sources, but also American and Australian sources. And all of them claim the active role of the mother in the transference of the embryo into the pouch. And none of these texts mentions the uncertainty that Owen was kind of still struggling with. So what we can see here is that, particularly in the more popular media, this hypothesis had hardened into a fact. So we might ask, well, maybe there was no riddle at all then. Yet, and I'm not quite sure why Abraham Bartlett said it like this. His son, Edward Bartlett, then kind of took up this issue again, wrote a short article about this question: how does the newborn kangaroo get into the pouch? And it was answered by an Australian, Dudley Lesseff, in the same magazine, and he's one of our protagonists as well. So now we're moving from the European zoo to Australia. In fact, the Australian zoo, for starters. He was at the time the director of the Melbourne Zoo and very well connected internationally, particularly with the UK. And he kind of maintains Owen theory when he writes that the newborn kangaroos are transferred by the mother, who uses her lips for the purpose, to the pouch. I checked whether the Australian zoos at the time, particularly in Melbourne and in Perth, had done any kind of research on that question, but I couldn't find anything. And now we come to our protagonist, August Görling. He was born in a small town near Bremerhaven in 1865. He graduated from Kiel, a major German port, Naval Academy, and worked then in the merchant marine. And already at a young age, kind of his life moved towards Australia, and he settles there outside Melbourne. He first works as a produce merchant, and then he starts a farm. And already at that time, sometime in the 1890s, he starts working as an animal trader for European customers. And a bushfire destroyed his farm and nearly killed his family, but they survived. But then they moved to the west of Australia, first to Fremantle or Perth, and then slightly later is a good bit to the north east, a huge called Malu Station, a huge ranch, if you like, a huge estate. And he continued or even increased his animal trading activities, exporting kangaroos and other like typically Australian animals, such as the Tasmanian devil, wombats, and sort of, etc., particularly to German zoos. And the point is that he caught them in the wild and then kept them at Malu Station in enclosures or in cages, a large number of different species of kangaroos, and that as a side effect provided the opportunity to observe their behavior and also what happened at birth. And Gerling was aware of this kind of debate that had started again around 1900. How does it get into the pouch? And of course, he knew Dudley Le Seff's work. Already in probably around 1890, one of his journeys back to Europe, he had met Adalbert Seitz. At the time, he was the ship doctor. But Seitz then, in 1893, became the director of the Frankfurt Zoo. And in particular, after he had lost everything in a fire in kind of the east of Australia, he renewed the contact with Seitz and managed to establish a very strong contact with the Frankfurt Zoo that served as a transfer station for all the animals that he delivered from Australia. That means that the Frankfurt Zoo had the first pick of the animals, and then the ones it wouldn't take could be sold on to other zoos. And if we look at the Frankfurt Zoo in the very early 19th century, it's an incredible number of different species of kangaroos that were could be seen there. And at one particular moment in 1907, for example, we have 18 different species, at least according to contemporary taxonomy, displayed at the same time. This, of course, included quite a number of species never seen before in Europe, including nowadays extinct species like the crescent nail-tailed wallaby, which you can see here in a taxidermy specimen and a drawing. Gerling collaborated with German animal traders such as Josef Menges. You can see here from kind of the accountant book of Menges that he did that kind of dealing with Gerling from Sydney. He was still in Sydney in 1902. You can also see, well, when he's already in the West and in 1904. So we have quite a good bit of correspondence, mostly including financial matters, how to transfer the money, and so on and so forth. And he also collaborated with Karl Hagenbeck, the most famous animal trader at the time. And actually, you see here 2 pages from the sales book of Hagenbeck, full of all the animals, the different animals, and the price that Gerling sold to Hagenbeck and then shipped to Europe. Some images from Marlou Station. There are many more. I picked, of course, those that depict kangaroos, and it kind of gives you a feeling of how kind of the proximity the Gerling family had with these animals. Even kind of the dog is very friendly with it. I don't know if you see on the chair, there's a little baby wrapped up in a blanket, and obviously even the dog takes a liking to the kangaroos. And here is one of the Gerling's son, Heinrich, in 1903, that might still be in Perth with cuddling kangaroos. That, of course, helps us understand how these close observations could take place. Because now we come to the decisive publication, if you wish, already made in 1906 on Marlou Station, but not published until early January 1913 in the Western Mail, a Perth newspaper, in the Mutual Help column, edited by the journalist Caton Grassby. And I just have the beginning of the article, The Birth of the Kangaroo, Original Observations by Mr. A. Gerling. And here come the decisive observations from 1906, published in 1913. The new born kangaroo moved slowly, very slowly through the fur upwards, using the arms in its progress and continually moving the head from side to side, thus assisting the upward movement. Nearly 30 minutes were required by the little wanderer to reach the top of the pouch, the last end in a semicircle. During the whole of the time, the mother paid no attention to her offspring, offering no assistance and leaving it entirely to its own exertion. And he continues, the arms of the newborn kangaroo are strongly developed. The small hands open and close like a cat's paw, and by these strong little arms and hands, the young one is enabled to labor its way to the pouch. So he's a very astute observer of the anatomy of the youngborn. The arms are actually stronger than the legs and help him climbing up towards the pouch. This is William Caton-Grasby, the journalist who edits this mutual help column, and he is very interested in kind of moving on the debate, encouraging his readers to publish their observations, their opinions on issues of natural history, and in particular the issue of the kangaroo birds comes up, I don't know in how many articles published in the Western Mail. So he's kind of the mover of the debate. So this article by Görling was published on the 4th of January, right, 1913. And what does Grasby do then afterwards? He actually travels to Melbourne, because also in early January, a few days later, there's the Congress of the Australasian Association for the Advancement of Science. And there he kind of comes up with this new knowledge, he thinks. He tries to convince the participants of the Congress of Görling's embryo hypothesis. That's not the mother, but the embryo itself that does all the work. And he writes, the idea was entirely new to each and all of them, and it seemed to them too wonderful to accept. Dudley Lesurf, who also participated in that Congress, was very empathetic in rejecting Mr. Görling's observation. Grasby went even further. He sent out cutouts of that article from January 1913 to over a dozen scholars, naturalists in Australia, Great Britain, and Ireland. But although the debate in the Western Mail continued, kind of, if you wish, a final confirmation did not come about until 1923, when in the Bronx Zoo in New York, a similar observation was made. And this is again Caton-Grasby in the Western Mail. When Mr. Görling first published observations, they were considerably doubted by scientific men who accepted the explanation that the mother placed the young in her pouch by means of her lips and her front paws. Readers of the Mutual Help column will know that a considerable number of confirmatory observations have been made by independent observers, chiefly Bushmen, and these observations from the Zoologists of America merely confirm what the readers of the Mutual Help column really already know. So you can feel here that the kind of satisfaction in a sense, but also being annoyed a bit, but that it took so long for the outside world to acknowledge this. Then in 1926, Alice Troughton publishes several observations by Görling and by other Australians, actually Colley and Hope, who made a similar observation already in the 19th century, to kind of make a definite case for the embryo theory. And interestingly, he again picks up that issue of the bush naturalists. He says, from the Thunbest Centre to the damp forests of tropical Queensland and over to Lewin, where the sun sets west of Australia, the problem of the birth and transference of the baby marsupial to the sheltering pouch provides much argument for the bush naturalist. And I also learned that in 1912, the Coat of Arms of Australia, the emu and the kangaroo were admitted, so to speak. So this was really kind of kangaroo was an important animal for kind of the self-image of Australians, and therefore this debate carried quite some weight. August Görling did not really, as far as we know, continue much. He rather turned to entomology in later part of his life, and even had some publications and an interesting collection, and he eventually died in 1941. And I shall come to my conclusions. Obviously, here we have a case of geography and hierarchies of knowledge. It has also been said about Australian science in the 19th century that it was kind of subservient to metropolitan science, and people like Owen, who reigned from London, dominated in all respects. But it turns out now that the zoo was only apparently the place where the riddle of the kangaroo birth was solved. And then, of course, the late 19th, early 20th century, the Australian science community forms were also with some kind of self-identity as Australian scientists. And it seems that Dudley Lussurf kind of takes over this authority from Owen. And I was just in the previous session on where also the issue of kind of Sydney centralism or Melbourne centralism came up. I'm obviously a newcomer in this field, but the kind of inner Australian hierarchy between Melbourne and Perth obviously played a role in this debate on the kangaroo birth as well, kind of the well-situated Dudley Lussurf and the farmer August Girling outside Perth. And we saw in the case of Captain Graspy how difficult it was to get the recognition for this new knowledge that had been published only, so to speak, in the Western Mail. And so what Captain Graspy do and what Troughton do is kind of revindicate the field as a site of knowledge production and this figure of the bush naturalist. So final question, did the field beat the zoo? Well, it's actually a bit more complex than that. Had the European zoo not demanded all these kangaroos from Girling, he would have not had the opportunity to observe so many different species so closely. So I think zoo and field are interwoven here. And we've also seen that to finally get the theory, new embryo theory acknowledged, all these observations from the Bronx Zoo were needed. They obviously still wielded more authority than the bush naturalist. And the brother of Dudley Lussurf, Albert Sherwin Lussurf, director of the newly founded Taronga Zoo outside Sydney, he then, in 1923, everybody knows, yeah, we're right, it's the embryo hypothesis. But in these sources, Girling is not really mentioned anymore. And just to conclude, the name of Girling was sometimes mentioned in these sources, but until very recently, we knew very, very little about this man, about his connections with Europe and German zoos, and the whole dynamic of knowledge production that was taking place. And this paper was trying to elucidate this a little. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you.
You're muted, Martin. We can't hear you, Martin. At least I can't.
Yes, sorry, I've got a complicated setup for how to mute and unmute myself here. And although I've got it working, I've got the technology working properly, I haven't quite got my myself working properly in regards to it. Thanks very much, Oliver. That was fantastic. Some of us were lucky enough to hear Oliver present a version of this paper to a joint University of Melbourne, University of Sydney HPS seminar earlier this year, but it's fantastic to hear it again. We've got plenty of time. Well, we've got some time for questions. We've got 7 or 8 minutes for questions and comments. Tess has dropped a couple of observations into chat already, and please do feel free to continue to do that along the way. But if anyone's got something they want to ask, or feel free to jump in. Ian?
Can I ask just a general question? I was somewhat astonished when I went to the museum in Vienna, that they had about 6 or 7 thylacine or stuffed thylacines in the museum. Was there a particular fascination with I'll say, the German people with Australian animals? Is it? There doesn't seem to be an obvious connection.
European naturalists in general were very curious about Australian fauna ever since the late 18th century, ever since Cook and others, and the fascination with, you know, marsupials. Are they real mammals? How do they procreate? How does the whole procreation works? And in particular, this is just one example, the kangaroo. So I don't think it's anything specifically German or Austrian. You find that in the UK, in France, wherever you go. It really questioned a lot of the taxonomy of what was supposed to be, you know, mammal, and therefore it engendered a lot of research. And then of course these animals got to the European zoos, and already by the mid 19th century, European audiences, European publics were very well, you know, used to seeing in particular kangaroos, and therefore kind of this whole question, how does it get into the pouch, you know, resonated with with audiences, and it was very, you know, it was very easy to understand this question, and therefore there's so much written about it.
Mm-hmm.
We have any further questions or comments? Guess you didn't want to elaborate on your comment in chat? Or?
If I just may throw a question into the audience, this notion of the bush naturalist, is that something familiar to you? To me, as an outsider to Australian history of science, that's the way I understand it, as a kind of a counter figure to the academic naturalist, but I might be wrong. What do you think? Is that very common around 1900 or whenever, this figure of the bush naturalist?
Is the hand up in response to that, or?
Kind of, yes. Thanks, Oliver, for that talk, which we've enjoyed when you gave it in the joint session already and now again. Regarding the bush naturalist, if I could recommend, perhaps you've already been in touch with people at the Australian Museum in Sydney. So there are quite a few historians, including Vanessa Finney, who's doing a PhD with us in Sydney, who's working on sort of a similar period, bush naturalist, and the way forms of knowledge interact, mediated through places like the museum that bring together, you know, local explorers, people trying to sell stuff. So there's quite an active community looking into that kind of knowledge production. And I'm sure they'd be keen to hear about your work, and perhaps you could have an interesting discussion about that. So I could put you in touch with Vanessa if that would be helpful.
That would be fantastic. Thank you very much, Maureen.
You're welcome.
Okay, well, with that, we may well throw over to Maureen and Daniela as our next speakers on the program. Maureen does philosophy and a little history of microbiology, as well as biology generally, in the School of History and Philosophy of Science at the University of Sydney. And Great. And Daniela does history and philosophy of technology and theory of history in the School of History and Philosophy of Science at the University of Sydney. And they are speaking to us today on The Woman Who Disappeared. And I'll hand over to you. Thanks very much. If everyone can join me in making them welcome.
Thank you very much, Martin. Maybe, so we've got this thing going here. We're moving in and out of the tree. So Maureen, if you could come forward. Oops, hi, this is Maureen and I'm Daniela. So for those of us who don't know us. So firstly, thanks to Martin for encouraging us to speak about this topic to this audience today, and in fact, in the context of a panel on Australian science. And what we'll talk about today is a woman who disappeared. Ilse Rosenthal-Schneider, who was a scholar who did significant, and you might say, groundbreaking work in HPS in Australia, but you may have never heard about her before because she pretty much vanished from the historical record and institutional memory. So that's partly why we have returned to her, figuring out how to move the mouse. You just click, I didn't click. Thanks. The joys of sharing one computer. So that's partly why we have returned to her. Firstly, simply because it turned out she was quite important for our own home institution at the University of Sydney and HPS here. But as we hope to show you today, she could actually be a good figure to think through what it means to be doing HPS in the present and in Australia. And the way we'd like to show you this in today's talk is in a way very simple and factual, given that hardly anything is widely known about Rosenthal-Schneider. We just want to run you through very basic data about her life and hopefully show you through this why we think this is a figure to think more deeply about other issues. So we'll do two things. We'll really draw out the two elements that we think are significant for understanding her work in HPS. And that's firstly, her intellectual background in the transition from 19th to 20th century philosophy of science. And then importantly, her life and work in Australia as a woman with no realistic academic career options. And that's work that comprises both work on Sydney University's campus in HPS in the 1940s to 60s, and importantly, a whole lot of regional outreach, where Rosenthal-Schneider took that intersection of science and philosophy well beyond the university. So firstly, who was this woman? Rosenthal-Schneider was born in the late 19th century near Berlin, and she was among the first generation of women who were admitted as university students in Germany in the early 20th century, so very late in international comparison. And on the picture on the left here, you see her working in the microscopy room at a military hospital in Berlin during World War I. But her main research topic was really the intersection of philosophy and physics, which is an unsurprising choice of topic in those years, which is the rise of what we now come to call modern physics, quantum physics and relativity theory. So these problems were really en vogue at the time. And accordingly, her dissertation, published in 1921, was on the space-time problem in Kant and Einstein. We won't have any time to go into the details of this today, but the one important thing to note is that against the mainstream, Rosenthal-Schneider argued for the compatibility of Kantian philosophy of science and Einstein's notion of space and time in general relativity. So that's against, to pick an up-and-coming important example, people like Reichenbach, who argue, at least rhetorically, something very different. And then, some 60 years later, her second main book comes out, Reality and Scientific Truth, a book that we will return to, because that looks very different from the dissertation and is a book that has baffled her readers, but that we argue can be read quite differently than it has been read. So back to those important elements for Rosenthal-Schneider's work. Firstly, her intellectual background. which you can sort of see here. She's in Berlin, studies from 1909, and is in this environment until the late 1930s, and studies with the intellectual luminaries of her field. On the left here, you see Alois Riehl, who was a fairly prominent neo-Kantian. And then to his right, those three gentlemen truly don't need an introduction. I'll just point out that we have three Nobel Prize winning physicists here, Einstein, von Laue, and Planck. And what's important to note about them is that all of these three were profoundly interested in these philosophical questions, very much at the intersection of physics and philosophy, and were keen to debate those with her. So that was just something that set them apart as physicists in their day and characterizes this milieu. And here we've got lurking in the background another major 19th century influence, Hermann von Helmholtz, who is the towering figure in German science in general, and also in physics. And the reason why he's here is sort of as a gesture back to the roots of philosophy of science in the 19th century, when that looked very different from what we think about it today. So Helmholtz really stands for those elements of a philosophy of science that is importantly continuous with the sciences themselves and driven by scientists in professional scientific appointments. And the second important element is that much of this philosophizing about science wasn't academic. It had, as in Helmholtz's case, a major component of what today you might call outreach. He thought it was important to have, philosophical discussions of the sciences blended with problems of their political and social significance, aimed at wider audiences well beyond the academy. For better or worse, this is not an unproblematic legacy in thinking about how the sciences achieve their cognitive authority. But the important bit here is these two elements, a continuity with sciences driven often by scientists, and an important element of outreach beyond the academy. And you can see the difference with what we think of often as philosophy of science today, which is an academic discipline and very much a sub-discipline of professional philosophy done by philosophers. So that's a crucial background for Rosenthal Schneider, but of course only part of it. The other bit you see gestured at here is that Rosenthal Schneider's career unfolds while the Nazis come to power. And like many other scientists, most prominently perhaps Einstein here, who left Germany in 1933 to never return, Rosenthal Schneider just makes it out of the country in 1938.
Okay, so in 1938, she leaves Berlin for the UK, makes a bit of a transit through Canada and comes to Sydney. She's with her daughter and her husband. She marries just after her PhD is completed and before it's published. They have one child, a daughter, Stephanie. She lives in Eastern Sydney. That's where she settles, and she stays there until her death in 1990. But immediately on arriving in the country, she sets out to recreate that intellectual milieu that she had known in Berlin. And of course, she does this at the university, which we'll get to, but she also renews her communications with von Laue and with Einstein. So they begin writing, despite this being the middle of World War II, they manage to keep corresponding. But she also, of course, goes to the university. We don't think she went to the philosophy department. She went straight to the faculty of science. If she went to philosophy, nobody was interested. She goes to the faculty of science and she persuades the dean that, in fact, science students need to know the history and philosophy of their disciplines. So in the middle, just as World War II is actually concluding, she starts giving lectures for undergraduates. But as well as that, she connects with the Extension Board, which is the name for what we now call continuing education at the university. And there she also gets many more hours in a much broader scope to give lectures on the history and philosophy of science to staff in any faculty, to any student that's interested and to registered members of the public. All of this goes very well. So much so that in the mid-1940s, there are rumors that there will be a permanent position in HPS, in the history and philosophy of science. But this job, as we probably know, never eventuates. Why doesn't it eventuate? Why can't she get a job for which she seems eminently qualified and for which she's already deeply engaged? And many of you will know that structurally it doesn't work for women in academia right up until 1966. The marriage bar set up by the Public Services Act in the early 1900s forbids married women, and especially women with children, from holding any kind of permanent and senior position. In some circumstances, married women and women with children can do casual lecturing or take on temporary roles, but they cannot become members of the academic faculty in any tenured way. So this obviously isn't going to work for her. And that is part of the reason why there's no trace of her, why she has disappeared from our accounts of HPS. She's got no ongoing academic position. She's doing this part-time work, some unconventional stuff, working for the Extension Board as well as the Faculty of Science. And that's why standard history, such as Alison Turtle's History of HPS in Sydney, completely fails to recognize all of the different things that Ilse Rosenthal-Schneider was doing at Sydney. So what Turtle's trying to do is explain the situation. Why doesn't HPS get going like it does in Melbourne and eventually in UNSW? And she tells this very sorry tale of all these disappointments and lost opportunities, but from the 1960s onwards. She does mention some of what's going on in the 40s and 50s, this pretty hopeless stuff. She mentions Rosenthal-Schneider twice, but minimal. She gives her at almost no importance. What Turtle says is official university records contain no indication that the lectures given by part-timers such as Ilse Rosenthal-Schneider in 1945 continued after that. Now we have plenty of evidence that they in fact continued into the 50s, as well as all the Extension Board work. So other sources, such as newspapers, tell a very different story than the institutional records. Newspapers such as Un Soir, the newspaper of University of Sydney students, chronicles the many contributions that Rosenthal-Schneider made to intellectual life at the university, both in the Faculty of Science, but also more broadly. In 1939, for example, fresh off the boat, somehow Rosenthal-Schneider gives in perfect English a lecture to the public, staff, students, and anybody interested from the outside on the border problems of science and philosophy. How do we determine what's science, what's philosophy? Where do they meet? What are the implications of how they have melded together in many of the aspects that she's interested in? This leads to much longer public lecture series, all funded by the Extension Board. This one, for example, in 1941, 7 one-hour lectures to a broad audience on reality and scientific truth. But more than that, she goes beyond the university. So she's not just blurring the boundaries of science and philosophy, but blurring the boundaries of academic science and science that is useful and interesting to the public. She gets involved in a major outreach program funded by the Extension Board of the university, where she gives numerous talks on science and philosophy all over New South Wales. So those red circles just show some of the places that she went. These are places she went to many times, so we've sort of marked them on the map. The whole Hunter Valley, Upper and Lower Hunter Valley, but also further in the south of New South Wales to Wagga, where she gave a talk almost every month over 20 years. She makes many visits to many of these places. In some of them, she has huge audiences, more than 200 people. She gives these talks on a vast array of topics and receives rapturous praise for them. And we'll show you just a little bit of each of those aspects. So these talks, even before World War II is reaching a conclusion, even before people know that it will reach some kind of conclusion, she's giving talks on how we can understand science philosophically in order to rebuild not just the country, but our own minds and our own views on the world. Several of her talks in the early 1940s were on this topic. She brings in many of the new advances in physics and particularly focuses on Einstein's general relativity theory to explain the relevance for members of these regional communities. She extrapolates from some of this theoretical musing to talk about how is it we should confront the post-war societies with this new science in mind. And even though she talks on very sophisticated topics such as space and time in Einstein's general relativity theory, the topic of her dissertation, nevertheless, she manages to communicate these sophisticated topics highly effectively. So if you look at the many regional newspapers of the time, what you can see is what we call this rapturous praise, this unstinting commendation of how she communicates the philosophy and the science to these broad audiences. Here are just a few quotes. We've got many dozens of them. She's a well-known lecturer in philosophy on the continent. Her easy conversational manner places her listeners at their ease. The only woman contributor in a book that commemorates Einstein's 70th birthday. One of the most brilliantly intellectual women in Australia at present. She really is a celebrity. And as you can see in this last quote, here it's emphasizing that she's a scientist, a brilliant intellectual, the foremost scientist of the day. So for her audiences, she's navigating both the philosophy and the science of it.
Thanks, Maureen. And so against that background, let's return to Rosenthal Schneider's sort of second major work, if you will, that comes out in 1980, as it happens 10 years before her passing, Reality and Scientific Truth. And the title tells you what she does in that book. Discussions with Einstein, von Laue and Planck. And indeed, that sums it up. The book is structured around these conversations and her correspondence with the three great men. And while there are topics like discussions of space and time or causality that are deeply philosophical in nature, the tone is anecdotal, chatty, a very, very different format from, for instance, her 1920 dissertation, which was really a piece of technical philosophy. This reads completely differently. And perhaps the most famous example is that anecdote about a telegram from Eddington that you can find in many tales about Einstein that comes from here, where Rosenthal Schneider relates that she's sitting with Einstein at his place discussing something, and suddenly he pulls off this telegram from the shelf and said, "Look what arrives," we're back in 1919, "from Eddington," who tells him about the results of his observation of the solar eclipse that famously confirmed the predictions by the theory of general relativity. And Rosenthal Schneider asks him, well, what would you have done had it not done that? And the famous line, "I would have pitied our dear God, the theory is correct." So that's the kind of stuff you can read in this book. It's fine. And needless to say, that was pretty much incomprehensible to philosophers of science. We've gathered some responses here to this book that kind of fall into two groups. One of them is really dismissively negative. So we've chosen here John Henry and Klaus Henschel, who basically think this is a chatty book in which she shows off with her connections with these three famous men, and there's nothing of real philosophical interest in there, and in fact it's misleading. And on the other hand, you have people like Yehuda Elkanah or Stephen Palmquist, who are effusively positive about it, but if you read them closely, don't actually engage with her arguments in a profound way either. But it kind of happens that her takes on the topics she discusses suit their own intellectual agendas. So what we would like to suggest in concluding is that this book is an interesting thing to look at. Its anecdotal style is seemingly so at odds with the philosophical and scientific content that it couldn't be read properly by professional philosophers of science in the discipline, so it's either forgotten or dismissed. But if you look at this book in the context of what we've talked about before, you can see that this curious format actually reflects those two things: that legacy of 19th century philosophy of science that through her physics mentors, Rosenthal Schneider continued to be committed to. This insistence on a genuine continuity between philosophy and the sciences that comes from both sides, from sort of people who are more on the philosophical side and people who have professional appointments as scientists. And secondly, this idea that this should have a component that reaches beyond the academy and professional philosophy only, because she sees that as a genuine social and ethical responsibility of science and the reflection about it. And of course, that reflects much more than just her connection with that 19th century legacy, but also the strategy that she adopted to make a career in Australia when structurally that was impossible within the academy proper. So she found a way to draw on that context and make a career that brought this kind of philosophical reflection to the sciences, to all sorts of regional places, and triggered genuine conversations about science in the post-war age. Again, a much broader global phenomenon, but Rosenthal Schneider's strategy reflects how that could look in Australia while she wasn't given a position at the University of Sydney. So that's why we think that Rosenthal Schneider is a good figure to think with, not just in terms of retrieving her story and sort of undoing the injustice of her having been written out of the record, but rather her story draws our attention to why she's been written out of the record and what this field looks like, what its understanding of the continuity or not between philosophy and the sciences is, and how we imagine our place in a wider and partly non-academic world as people thinking about the philosophical significance of the sciences. So these are topics that we think she brings into view precisely because she had to circumvent the professionalized philosophy of science and HPS structures that came into being in Australia and that you can read in the conventional stories that Maureen related to you earlier. So yes, that happened, but many other things happened, and she's one example of how we can look back at history to retrieve them and think about our field in the present. So that's our aim with her, and we look forward to any questions and comments you may have, and we acknowledge our administrator, who actually was influential in making all of this happen, Debbie Castle.
Thanks very much. That was, yeah, fantastic. And again, plenty of time for questions and comments. I was very pleased. I understand that this paper was also presented to University of Sydney HPS, but I wasn't able to attend that one, so I'm personally very pleased to hear the presentation here. That was really good. As I dropped into chat, I'm particularly fascinated by that emphasis on extension and public lectures, and you know, you draw you know, very valid conclusions from that, I think. I'll just start off with a question, just which, you know, I was going to ask a few questions which you then, you know, sort of answered through your presentation as they came up. But I just ask, in terms of the records for that, I mean, you indicate that the newspaper record of those public lectures seems to be pretty good. Is the Extension Board archives rich in that regard, or do they?
We don't know. So we haven't, if it is, then all of Alison Turtle's digging about in the institutional records didn't turn those up. And we haven't gone that far. You know, we've just picked up a few clues from the newspaper stuff that made us realize there's a bit of a story here. What we're hoping to do is actually get some funding to get some students working on the archives, because there's a lot more material in the State Library of New South Wales that we haven't accessed. So quite a lot to do there.
Yeah, when I've looked at those archives for earlier years, they do get a bit patched. Some years are well documented and some years are really not so well documented.
Yeah. So what we're not sure of is the, you know, the status of the formal records of the Extension Board and how illuminating they're going to be. But certainly the regional newspapers, almost all of which do not exist now, have been incredibly helpful for sort of tracking down what she did.
Thanks. Oliver, you've got a question?
A fantastic paper, and I would like to know, what does Rosenthal Schneider say about herself? Do we have any ego documents? How does she describe herself, and also her development, her evolution? This is just a question: is it like her Berlin phase was? Can we describe that more as a research phase, and the Australian phase and the Melbourne, etc. phase more of a outreach person, and I don't know if popularizer is the right word, because she couldn't resume her academic career in a very strict sense. So was it kind of the only thing she could do was reaching out, popularizing, etc. And how did she see herself as a also in the Australian period, still as a researcher or more as a facilitator? So thank you.
Thanks, Oliver. Good question. So sort of two parts to the question, right? The first is a sort of source situation, ego documents. Typical immigrant story, very, very little in terms of ego documents throughout. So almost everything that we have found so far isn't that. You've got some family documents, not written by her hand, that in some views of what an ego document is would fall into that extension, but by her own hand in the strict sense. Very little and pretty much nothing that speaks to her view of herself. Which in fact by our views is fine, but so that's we can talk more about this, but the short answer is hardly anything, because whatever records there were has largely been destroyed. So some letters that touch on some vaguely personal aspects are the closest you could get to the documents that are traditionally thought of as relevant for the reconstruction of that kind of biographical account. So that's that side. The other side of that, so rather than trying to reconstruct how she viewed herself in terms of her role, which we have few sources for, we are looking at what she's been doing, right? And I think the distinction that you raised there is precisely the one that we think her life record puts a lot of pressure on. A distinction between an understanding, whether from the inside or from the outside perspective on her life, a distinction between this is the real research side and the second one is the communication side. Because I think, that is precisely how her philosophical perspective on the stuff she was talking about sets her apart from the kind of science communication that we look at today, which is, has been written about loads and loads, a kind of how do I dumb down science for a stupid audience. That is precisely not, we think, what she's interested in doing her, because her philosophical perspective on this scientific philosophical continuity would put her closer into a perspective where these things aren't easily put apart in a sort of, this is the academic research side versus communication side. But I would venture into saying that is a very prevalent distinction applied left, right, and center in Australia today, and one that would be very helpful to have figures and themes to think with to undermine a little bit. And that's to the extent that we can interpret her life, we think it gives the grounds for this. And I believe Maureen
Just
would have something to add.
And maybe another of these kind of continuous things that, there's a break, of course, between Berlin and Sydney, but I don't think we don't think the break is intellectual. So in Sydney, in Berlin, she faces the same structural difficulties. Einstein and von Lauer don't endorse her for a position, for a professorship. They endorse Hans Reichenbach, who comes up through the ranks a little bit after her. She can't get a job as a woman. She's already doing science journalism in Berlin before they leave. And she sees this as a calling, as part of this general thing. And I think that gets extended in Sydney. She sees this as an opportunity, an opening to continue that way of doing things in the face of those structural impossibilities.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. Any further questions or comments?
I just have a quick look at the chat. Yeah. Thanks, Tess. Yes. Yeah, so there's plenty more there to think with, and yes, other disciplines to connect it with too. So that's our hope, right? That through looking at some of those figures, we can broaden our horizon as a discipline a bit. Thank you.
Great. Well, we'll move on to our next presentation. It's by Ian Tusker. Unfortunately, Ian had to withdraw from participation in this conference. He does have a recorded presentation, which I will be able to play for you. You'll just have to give me a minute because I'll have to switch off the room audio so that I can play the presentation through my laptop. Okay. I should be right now. Is that, can everyone hear me okay? Someone shout out if they can hear me. Yep, excellent. Okay. Everything's open, but I should be able to share my screen now. Everyone can see that okay. And I should be able to hit play and
Ian Tusker, and I am researching how Sydney Observatory became embroiled in a constitutional debate during the first half of the 20th century, which saw a professor replaced with a bureaucrat. Ian Tusker.
Yep.
My focus is on the constitutional debate between 1927 to 1939, though it has its roots back in 1912, around the overlapping of Commonwealth and state services. In particular, I'm examining Commonwealth funding for state observatories that were carrying out internationally managed science, which I define on the next slide. The debate focused not on the merits of the science being produced, but on which level of government was responsible for funding and executive oversight. The Commonwealth government wanted to consolidate any overlapping services and centralise them. Yet they argued that they were not prepared to set up a new observatory managed at a Commonwealth level, or to fund the state-managed observatories that were conducting international science. The state governments wanted to force the Commonwealth government to take up its responsibilities as per the Constitution, which meant moving their observatories to dark sky science and funding them to conduct international research. It was against this backdrop that physicists were agitating for the creation and funding of a new Commonwealth Observatory, which would employ them as they were not able to be employed at the state-managed observatories. Sydney Observatory is the case study, studied between 1912 and 1941. Amid this debate, the New South Wales state government replaced an internationally recognised, technically competent Professor of Astronomy at the University of Sydney, W. Ernest Cook, the incumbent Sydney Observatory Director, with an unsalaried amateur astronomer, James Nangle, a retired professional bureaucrat. Housekeeping the observatory. The beginning of the 20th century marks a turning point whereby politicians were replacing scientists with bureaucrats in astronomy and its related fields of surveying, navigation, and aviation. In the first half of the 20th century, New South Wales government astronomers suffered at the hands of the state government from consistently underfunding their work in undertaking internationally managed science. These are programs that require the pooling of resources of numerous institutions worldwide, governed by an international body. In this case, the internationally managed science under consideration was the production of the astrographic catalogue managed by the International Astronomical Union. Sydney Observatory was one of 4 Australian observatories that were involved in a group of 20 observatories worldwide working on the astrographic catalogue. Under the terms of the Australian Constitution, section 51(8), it should have been the Commonwealth Government that funded Australia's contributions to these international efforts. However, there was no Commonwealth mechanism to provide executive oversight and funding for Australian observatories involved in international science, which left the state observatories at the mercy of their own state's economic considerations. In a game of strategy, state governments threatened to close their observatories rather than to continue to fund them in an effort to force the Commonwealth Government to take up its commitments without success. This critical constitutional debate has not been written up in the academic literature. My interest is in the significance, influence, and affiliations of the government astronomers and their relationships with Sydney Observatory stakeholders. The stories of the astronomers encompasses relationships between amateurs, professionals, universities, governments, national scientific bodies, international unions, and astronomical societies. The New South Wales government astronomer was initially the central figure in this environment until his forced displacement by a bureaucrat, which had the unintended effect of weakening the voice of the astronomical sciences. The New South Wales government astronomer made himself unpopular with the politicians by insisting that they honour the promises made to him in his original employment contract. Cook had argued in vain that Sydney Observatory could and should play a critical role in the war effort and in technological advancements internationally. Cook was effectively silenced and his proposed research went unfunded. Rather than honour their commitments, Cook was forced into early retirement. Documenting this episode has important lessons with regards to lost opportunity and opportunity costs. One effect of changing the observatory's directorship is seen in the drop-off in its scientific production once Nangle takes the helm. The publication's record will be unpacked in my thesis. The Australian Constitution was drafted in the 1890s in an era when the framers could not foresee the advent of new technologies such as radio broadcasting. This new method was employed in astronomy for longitudinal determinations via wireless time signals. Cook proposed to refine the mapping of the Pacific to assist the war effort. He was blocked by the state government, who believed that this exercise should be funded by the Commonwealth, with no regard paid to the impact on the outcome of the war effort or on the advancement of international science. Neither was the Commonwealth government interested in such matters. When the new nation's constitution was framed, astronomy and meteorology were the only fields of scientific endeavour in which the Commonwealth sought power to legislate. Because of the long-standing links between the astronomical and meteorological activities of the colonies, astronomy was eventually included along with meteorology in the provision of Section 51(8) of the Constitution. Later constitutional remonstrances supporting the divorcement of meteorology from astronomy oversimplified the nationalism of weather patterns with international collaborations, tasks across the astronomical sciences, such as Mapping the Night Sky, Astrographic Catalogue Project. The Commonwealth refused to fund any of the state observatories, although they were conducting internationally managed science, the domain of the Commonwealth. The New South Wales state government pressured the Commonwealth government to take up its responsibilities with regards to funding Sydney Observatory. Without success, I will document the winners and losers from this era. The process and aims of this study align with the proposed methodology of a histographic narrative. There will be three types of primary source documents used. I'll be carrying out a critical analysis of the narrative, highlighting the ongoing political, bureaucratic, and policy changes. Cross-referencing the interactions between astronomers and their boards with the bureaucrats and premiers will offer multiple perspectives within this ecosystem. This critical analysis approach will permit me to map the informal dynamics in play at Sydney Observatory to reach conclusions. I would like to draw your attention to the final reference on this slide regarding William Ernest Cook and the triangulation of the Pacific by wireless time signals that I referenced on slide 5 and allude to on slide 7. My timeline reflects that I will be commencing in August 2021 and have been accepted to present at this year's Hybridity, Diversity and Research Conference the 13th Annual Intersections and Interventions HDR Student Conference for Western Sydney University between the 11th and 13th of November, and also at the Australasian Association for the History, Philosophy and Social Studies of Science Conference being hosted at Wollongong University from the 24th to the 26th of November. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Ian, in absence for that presentation. Ian has indicated that he will welcome any questions or comments that people had on that, but obviously they will need to be submitted via email, and I'm happy to pass them on if anyone has any questions, comments, feedback. Retrospectively, I'll give Ian's biographical note that his study fits into the broader social conversation around research funding, given that the federal government has been slashing funding of academia during the current pandemic, and also note that Ian is a current executive member on the ARPS committee. So we'll move straight on to Joel List. So the three previous papers we've had have all been historical in nature, but we're turning now to a contemporary issue of science, technology and regulation in Australia with Joel Lisk presenting. Joel Lisk's PhD research explores how nations legislate for commercial activities in outer space while balancing the interests of private industry and their international obligations, with a particular focus on how Australia's laws have developed over time. And I will, with that, hand it across to you, Joel. Thanks for everyone join me in making Joel welcome.
Thanks, Martin. Appreciate it. Just share my screen quickly. Okay, thank you. As Martin introduced, my presentation today will address a bit of a contemporary issue, but it's quite important historical basis to it. So the question of how does industry drive regulation in Australia? And I think it flows on quite well from that commentary by Ian on the constitutional issues and some of the regulatory interactions when it comes to space sciences and even observations in space. I'd just like to first recognise that I'm making this presentation today on the lands of the Kaurna people, and we respect and acknowledge their past, present and ongoing connection to the land. So the focus of my presentation is probably a little bit different from many other ones we've had today, in the sense that it is focusing on more contemporary activities, what's happening into the future. And I'll be talking a lot about the development of the law that's associated with the space industry, and a focus on what is called, and I'm terming, access activities, which I'll touch on and what that definition actually means in a moment. But then I'll jump into a bit of the regulatory regime in Australia and how it does impact on industry, and the role that industry then plays in developing the law that we have today in the space sector. But it also does have a bit of impact on other sectors and related areas when it comes to industry regulation more generally. And so what I'll do in this presentation is I'll start with a little bit of scene setting, a bit of background, looking a bit of international law, Australian law, and then delve really into what we have today in Australia in that role of industry. So one of the things I wanted to start off with is I'm going to be only talking about what I call access activities. So that's activities that involve the placement of an object into outer space or the return of an object from outer space. So that's what we normally think of as a rocket launch. And I think it's fair to say that you can't have a presentation about rocket launches without a video of one being in the presentation. And so what I've got here is a rocket launch by SpaceX from a couple of years ago. And so the activities we're talking about are these types of launch, plus also the returning of space objects. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit in this video to show what that is. So I think we're relatively familiar now with this idea of rockets actually coming back from space and landing. So what we don't generally think about is that these activities are highly regulated. And they're highly regulated at several different levels, and the different levels interact with each other along with different national policies to produce the law we see every day. So for the industry regulation, we actually start with an international basis. Space is regulated to a degree at the international level because the international community in the early 1950s determined that there was a need to set a common set of rules for outer space. And this was in many respects to create norms of behaviour and ensure that everyone was acting in a way that respected other people's interests and other nations' interests and preserved the domain for future uses. So this action generally manifested itself through, in the first instance, United Nations General Assembly resolutions, and was quickly followed by the establishment of the United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, the development of multilateral treaties, so big treaty instruments between numerous countries, and has now moved into more of a phase of production of non-binding guidelines and frameworks that assist nations in developing laws and practices that protect the space domain and protect everyone's use of it. With that, I'm going to touch in various generalities on the key frameworks here are around that international basis. So this slide touches on a few of the provisions that are relevant in what is known as the Outer Space Treaty of 1967, which is one of the most highly subscribed space-related treaties, about 120 national parties as at the day of this presentation. So in generalities, that treaty focuses on broad principles of uses of space. So it's there to protect the benefit of all humankind. It's there to promote peaceful purposes and peaceful uses of outer space. And it also codifies obligations to have due regard to other people. So what you do in space, you must have due regard for the actions of others. Slightly interesting with this particular treaty, there are also actionable requirements that require some form of regulation. So there is an obligation on nations to authorize and supervise the activities of non-governmental entities in outer space. And this was a provision that was inserted into the treaty in the 1960s, far beyond and far before we were thinking about commercial actors in outer space. So there was a bit of forethought here. Interestingly, also the Outer Space Treaty apportions liability for actions to nations, so they must pay financial damages. And this applies irrespective of whether a country is carrying out an activity or whether its nationals are carrying out an activity. I've also included a quick excerpt from one of the provisions of the Outer Space Treaty that becomes quite important for regulation at a national level, and that is this obligation that governmental entities shall authorise and continually supervise the actions of non-governmental entities in outer space. And it's been a relatively controversial provision, I think it's fair to say, for many international actors as to what it actually means and what the extent of that authorisation and that supervision truly is. So jumping straight now into what is the space sector, and it's relatively fair to say that the commercial space sector and the private space sector really emerged in the 1960s. So before that point in time, space was exclusively the domain of the government actor. So that was because the extreme expense and mainly strategic uses being deployed in the space sector. So commercial players weren't really involved and weren't really seeing the interests and the need to be involved. But once the 1960s happened and we started having launches a little bit more regularly, that's when commercial interests started to really see potential. And so that's when we started to see the development of commercial space communication satellites, such as this one here, which is a picture of one of the first commercial communication satellites to reach space, which was Telstar 1. We later then began to see Earth observation, so that is imaging of the Earth, become a more important issue. And then eventually we've jumped into launch, which is those access activities that I'll touch on in a moment. Now, it'd be very difficult to talk about the commercial space industry without really talking about the United States. In many respects, they're a leader in this field, but that is now also having to be paired with the actions in other countries, such as in France, Japan, China, New Zealand, where we're seeing more. But historically, this is where most of the activity was happening. But for a little period there in the 80s, it actually didn't look like we would have much of a commercial launch sector. So early 80s Reagan administration policy was to actually scale back what were called expendable launch vehicles. So those rockets that would take off once and be disposed of immediately after. So you wouldn't reuse any part of that. So Reagan's administration had decided to release presidential directives saying that there were to be less uses of these ELVs, and there was to be a serious focus on the Space Transportation System, or as most of us probably know it as the Space Shuttle. And that the Space Shuttle was going to be used for all launches, irrespective of who was doing it. So it's commercial, other governments, the United States Defence, as well as their more civil space priorities. Everything was intending to be launched on the Space Transportation System. In many respects, this linked in very closely with the need to justify the significant investment the United States government had made in the infrastructure and those assets. So with more launches, the investment starts to look a bit more reasonable. But at this point, private interests were already entwined with government activity. So there were several different expendable launch vehicles that were being used by the US government, and they were all manufactured by what was then the private defense industrial base. So that's where we saw McDonnell Douglas, General Dynamics, Martin Marietta, as well as Rockwell, who were building the Space Transportation System. So all of these entities faced the possibility that they were no longer needing to build rockets, that the government was no longer going to buy their rockets unless they were part of the Space Transportation System program. But it all changed, unfortunately, after the Challenger disaster happened in 1986. And you can see a very clear and a very obvious split in policy. So the Reagan administration moved from the position that STS was to be used for every launch possible to only for national security, national priorities, civil space priorities, science priorities, and commercial actors were to look elsewhere. So in a sense, this started to reinvigorate and create the need for a commercial space sector. And it's fair to say that this was the birth of the commercial space sector that we see today. In the EU, around the 80s period as well is when we started to see the development of the first true private space company in the form of Ariane Space, which was a private venture between France as the majority owning nation and several other European nations to develop a private/commercial launch entity to do most of those commercial satellite and communication launches. This involved a serious transfer of IP and technology from the European Space Agency into Ariane Space. But from that point onwards, the intention was to actually allow that entity to do all the launching activity. Now, at the same time, the USSR had been developing and using its Soyuz launch vehicle for a while, and they then allowed Ariane Space to also use that for their commercial customers. And other nations were also developing their own launch vehicles to be used for private interests. This, interestingly, considering the US position, was creating a bit of tension. This was very much of the view that government-backed and government-supported commercial launch companies probably were not having a negative impact on the market because they were undercutting the prices that the private industry in the US were able to provide. So it reached a point where the US are very concerned about new market rules and how the entities were meant to operate with each other. But what this all ended up with is an imperative to regulate, an obligation to do so, and a need to really consider what regulation in this area looked like. So we take that international obligation to authorize and supervise, and we mix it with those policy considerations about the desire to have a local space industry, the high-tech jobs, the inspirational aspects that come with that, and balance that against a need for public health and safety, because the last thing you want is a rocket falling on private property or on someone's house or endangering life more generally, the need to prevent against sovereign financial risks and the liability risks that a nation takes on when it allows private activities, and then balancing it back again against those commercial interests that where there is regulation, there is certainty. So businesses can rely upon regulation from the government perspective to encourage investment and to develop new technologies from that regulatory base. And it provides them with that stable ecosystem to operate within. And so in that period of the 80s, we saw 3 real countries act in this area. Sweden was shockingly the first nation to create an act on space activities in 1982. And was followed by the Commercial Space Launch Act of 1984 in the US and the Outer Space Act in 1986 in the United Kingdom. Now, these legal regimes are all what we'd probably consider in the legal industry just standard permit and control regimes. Something is prohibited by default unless you have a license to do so. They're relatively simple legal regimes, but they're broad in their application in that they apply not just to activities conducted within your national borders, but also to a country's citizens overseas and nationals overseas. So jumping straight now into the Australian regulation section. Australia has had a rich history in outer space. I think it's fair to say we've kind of touched on everything at some point in time. So you think about the Woomera Prohibited Area playing a significant role in the testing and development of original launch activities. So the European Launcher Development Organisation, which was the precursor to the European Space Agency, was originally set up to test its launch vehicles in Woomera. The United States and the United Kingdom both tested their, not just their launch vehicles, but also missile technology out in Woomera. And this actually led to Woomera becoming the second largest and second most prolific space launch facility in the world, following Cape Canaveral, operated by NASA in the US. So it's really created that there was this serious industry around launch activities here in Australia in the 60s and the 70s. Australia was also the third nation to launch a satellite from its own territory on the 29th of November 1967. So that was with RESAT, and we used a US-UK joint launch vehicle provided by them to do that for our own territory, which is exciting. Australia was also an active and encouraging member of the international community and really jumped on all of the different space treaties it could relatively early on. So we were very much involved in the drafting of most of the legislative instruments, but for the Moon Agreement, signed up within a year or so of them being finalised. The Moon Agreement was about 5 or 6 years after the fact. So this is when we come now to the commercial imperative and that commercial interest that's incredibly important for why regulation is developed and how we do develop regulation. So when it got to the late 80s, the Australian government was approached by several different operators of commercial activities to launch rockets from Australia. So we saw Kistler Aerospace, an American company, want to launch their rockets from Woomera. United Launch Systems and the Asia Pacific Space Centre were both exploring the idea of launching vehicles from the Cape York Peninsula, and the Asia Pacific Space Centre was also looking at Christmas Island. But why were they doing this? Australia has brilliant geography to be able to operate launch vehicles from. We can do what's called a sun synchronous or polar orbit by launching north-south, and Cape York and Christmas Island are in a brilliant position for geostationary orbits. So that's the very valuable orbit for commercial satellites and commercial communication satellites. So there was a lot of private governmental, non-governmental interest in Australia as a facility, as a place to launch rockets from. And it probably links a lot as well to our stable political environment and being allied to many of those nations that were involved in space activities at the time. All of these three operators were looking at using expendable launch vehicles, and we're really looking at exploiting that rapidly growing commercial space sector. The late 80s and the early 90s really saw a boom in the idea of using space for communications and using it for broadcasting. So that was an ideal time really to look at what activities were happening and what commercial providers could bring to the table. Several of the proposals were actually considering using technology out of the USSR as it was at the time. So United Launch Systems and the Asia Pacific Space Centre were both wanting to use technology that was developed in what is now Russia. And of course, that created some interesting political tensions around what technology can be allowed outside of the Soviet Union and what can be brought into a foreign country such as Australia, especially with our close connections to the United States. And so that's when we really get then to the response to this commercial interest. So in 1990, there is a press release from the White House at the time, essentially stating that the US had agreed to allow the Soviet Union to export its space technology to Australia for the purpose of commercial launches, and to ensure that then there can be some sort of US involvement in that. In many respects, you might look at that and think, why does the United States need to be involved in launching in Australia that has nothing to do with them? But unfortunately, all of the proponents who were looking at launching from Australia had some sort of connection or interest in the United States. So there was a need for some consideration of the US interests here. And so as a consequence, the Soviet Union had actually agreed to provide its technology to Australia and then only launch in Australia and the Soviet Union. So they weren't going to export it to any other countries. And both nations agreed to join on to the Missile Technology Control Regime, which is focused on the non-proliferation of missile technology. In 1992, in response to a lot of this development, there was establishment of a Senate inquiry into what needs to happen to ensure Australia has a commercial satellite launching industry. And one of the key requirements that came out of that was the need by proponents that they were saying that there is a need for regulation. There is a need for that solid base to develop a commercial industry, and that the Commonwealth of Australia, so the federal government, was the responsible entity for that. And this actually then did lead to regulatory action. So there was an agreement between the Commonwealth of Australia and Kistler Aerospace using its Australian subsidiaries, where they both parties entered into an agreement to actually allow launches of commercial space vehicles from Woomera. Unfortunately, the agreement was never had to be used, as there were no launches by Kistler from Woomera, but it showed a willingness of the government to actually act in this respect and to do this. Similarly, around the same time, unfortunately, we don't know the date of the agreement between the Commonwealth and Kistler, as it's still subject to cabinet confidentiality requirements. There was another cabinet submission on the development of a framework to support commercial space launch activities out of Australia. And that eventually then led to what was called the Space Activities Act of 1998, which created a licensing regime which covered launch facilities, launch activities by Australians here in Australia or by Australians overseas, as well as returns of space objects back to the Earth. So what we saw was sort of serious commercial interest in Australia, and the governments of the time, so that was between Hawke, Keating and Howard, really responding to those interests and actually developing a legal regime that was there to suit them. And then we saw the next stage, which was the development of regulations under that Act in 2001. Unfortunately, between 1998 and 2001, with no regulations, nothing could happen under the Act, which really hampered a lot of the activities that were starting to build momentum. And then additional amendments to the Act were made in 2002, really around commercial interests yet again. So at this point, the commercial entities interested in Australia and had the time to look at the law and had made additional suggestions about what would be workable for them. And the government of the day, which was the Howard government, did respond to that by adjusting the liability position for operators, so making it more attractive to be in the Australian market, introducing protections for sensitive assets, as there was concern from those extracting oil in northern Australia that if a rocket was to land on one of their operations, it would cause significant harm. And leaving some of the regulatory burdens around approving for licenses and the process involved, and adjusting the license process for educational institutions, which unfortunately weren't considered in the initial law, which made space activities incredibly prohibitive for Australian universities. So since that time, and even up to today, there has not been a single orbital launch from Australia. Unfortunately, all of the commercial interests and the commercial entities that were really looking at establishing themselves here in Australia, their ventures unfortunately all fell through. There was a suborbital test launch of what's called a HiShot-1 rocket that was authorised in 2001. That was operated by the University of Queensland. So that was a successful use of the Act, but unfortunately it didn't reach outer space. But there have been several what we call overseas launch certificates issued to Optus during the period of about 1998 to about 2010. And that is really the only activity that was happening with the Space Activities Act. So by about 2008, all real interest in an Australian domestic launch industry and capability had evaporated. And I just thought it'd be interesting to note at this particular point as well, is this timeline of when Australia's activities really dipped and didn't really come to fruition, was when we saw the creation and the establishment of companies such as Space Exploration Technologies, or SpaceX, which is Elon Musk's company, as well as Blue Origin, which is Jeff Bezos's company, which both of them you can now see are relatively active and incredibly successful in the American launch market. Now, around the early 2010s, we really saw what we call now the new space, or the Space 2.0 industry. So that is the establishment of industries which focus very much on small technology, cost-efficient technology, and startup businesses that are really not capital intense. So they need low costs, and they're focusing on ways to reduce the cost of access and activities in outer space, which really then led to industry going to the Australian government at this time that your act in the 1990s law was no longer fit for purpose. It was built at a time, constructed at a time for industry interests that are very much larger than us. They're not overly relevant to us anymore, unfortunately. The scale of activity is entirely different. You know, we might want to launch a shoebox-sized satellite, whereas in the 90s we were looking at 2 or 3 tons. We really need to try this again and really start to look at what we have and think about what industry we have and how that suits our needs. And so a bit of industry lobbying began at a whole bunch of different levels, ranging from academia right through to the industry themselves. And that eventually led to a review of the Australian Space Activities Act in 2015. And its key focus was on facilitating the new space and the Space 2.0 agendas. And conveniently, that lined up quite well with the Turnbull government's jobs and growth initiative and innovation agenda around that time. So the idea of reforming legal frameworks to promote and encourage new and interesting technologies to come out of Australia. And the minister of the time, which was Christopher Pyne, in his announcement of the review, was very much focused on ensuring that space regulation stimulates investment and innovation, but also protects the public safety and the public interest of Australians. So that was really set up as the end goal, was to consider what we have today and how we can continue to push and promote industry in Australia further while still protecting ourselves. This eventually resulted in the establishment of the Space Launches and Returns Act, which was an amendment to the existing Space Activities Act. The name changed to more accurately describe what it does. But overall, there weren't many changes which frustrated many in industry, it's fair to say. But it did tinker around the edges. It really took the edge off the really harsh obligations, or those that were not compatible in any way with how the new space and the new economy worked. And industry were part of this entire process. So there was multiple stages of consultation with both with industry, with government, with international expertise, and international legal experts were brought in to consult on components of what is now the Space Launches and Returns Act to ensure it could actually suit industry in a way that it needed to. The bill that amended the Space Activities Act was again scrutinised by another Senate committee, and there was further consultation as part of that process. The development of regulations, or what now called rules, under that act involved additional consultations yet again. And then there was an ultimate consultation yet again on the imposition of fees under that act, which haven't yet happened. But of course, the Australian Space Agency are consulting very heavily, because when you put fees onto licenses, there tends to be some sort of definite industry backlash or consequences as a result of that. So industry were there every step of the way, but it keeps going. And there was another inquiry announced in November of 2020. So that's a House Committee on Industry, Innovation, Science and Resources Committee inquiry into how we continue to develop our space sector, how we can continue to foster it to grow, to promote more jobs, to really to go that next step and make Australia a world leader in this area. And that committee is still underway and hasn't yet released its final report, and we don't know when. But it has heard from a broad cross-section of industry that there are still concerns about the regulatory regime. So it's fine to consult on these matters several times over, but unfortunately, if the government doesn't act or doesn't respond with legislation that addresses those needs, industry have continued, and to their credit, have continued to push for their own interests, which is remarkable. And this aligns with that consistent need to advance and to innovate the law to line up with technology as it changes and it increases. Comparatively, this has been happening quite a lot overseas as well. So very, very similar to Australia, New Zealand introduced what's called the Outer Space and High Altitude Activities Act in 2017, entirely in response to a launch operator coming to them saying, we would like to launch from New Zealand. New Zealand took the same approach as entering into an agreement with Rocket Lab at the time, as Australia entered into an agreement with Kistler, and then eventually transitioned them onto the Act. So that in many senses, a very similar development process to Australia, but unfortunately for Australians, it worked much better in New Zealand with a serious commercial interest to be pushed forward. In the United Kingdom, there was a development of what was called the Space Flight Bill, and industry received the draft and roundly condemned it. So the UK government actually started again and produced what is now called the Space Industry Act of 2018, which is a much more industry-focused law that addressed many of their concerns at the time. Early on in President Trump's presidency, he, by executive order, required the Federal Aviation Administration, the regulator of launch activities and access activities in the US, to review all of its regulations associated with launch with a view to streamlining them and ensuring they fit industry, which they did relatively quickly. And then Japan responded as well around the same time with a brand new law addressed to new types of activities because its industry was looking to engage in them. So this is not just an Australian phenomenon responding to industry, it's definitely an international one. And this really leaves us with the idea that what is the role of industry in this particular area, in particular area of regulation? So it's the driver of change and the driver of new law creation. So government, of course, needs to act in accordance with its international obligations. It needs to address policy incentives, especially around the development of high technology industry, the support and the building of supply chains and internal sovereign capabilities. And there's that idea that failing to act and failing to regulate in a way that your industry is looking at actually prevents them from emerging at all. And so it stifles industry to the point where they leave Australia or they leave the nation that's looking at these laws and go elsewhere. But there's also that requirement to provide certainty and security operation to new companies, to startups, to businesses generally, because that's how capital is generated. No one tends to invest in businesses or activities unless they can be assured of some sort of return. But there's also some hard lessons involved, so that industry does not always like regulation, and regulation does not always suit, and there's always scope for change and improvement. And there's always a need to then balance public health and safety interests, national security interests, and economic interests against the interest of businesses who want to operate in an area. It's fair to say that a rocket launch company might want to launch something from the middle of Adelaide for where I am right now, but of course that's not going to be an activity that's overly safe, and it's probably not in the national interest or economic interest to do so. So that activity will be prevented from happening because of regulation. And another thing to really think about is that national risk profiles frequently don't align with the risk appetites of private enterprise. In the startup sector, it's fair to say that there's a churn and burn approach, that things will happen quickly. If it doesn't work, you fail, you try again, you do something new. Government, unfortunately, doesn't have that freedom to make those kind of decisions and that kind of risk profile. So in summation, it's fair to say that industry drove the introduction of the Space Activities Act in 1998. The 2002 amendments responded directly to their concerns around financial risks and needing to operate in an efficient and easy manner. The 2018 amendments were responding directly to a new wave of activity, a new range of industry, and really focusing on that smaller scale. But industry continues to push, and they continue to force innovation and regulation, especially around the idea of certainty for activities now and into the future, as well as to ensure that the laws are reasonable in their operation and balance the public and private interests. So that's my presentation. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Joel. Everyone join me in thanking Joel for that presentation, and got plenty of time for questions and comments, so please do jump in. Question or comment there?
Do we put our hands up, or do we just ask the question? How
You can
does
just
this
go Ian, Thomas, and then Ian.
Okay. Hey, Joel, great to see you. You did a fantastic presentation.
Thanks, Thomas, and thanks for suggesting I make it.
No, absolutely. It's good to have you. Good to have you here. I was just going to ask, so the committee, I remember seeing that last year. Sorry, I know it's really dark where I am. I'll just try and brighten that up a bit. The committee last year, so obviously, the COVID times and all that, is there any idea as to when they might meet? Do you know, or is there any feedback from the parliamentary committee on the reviews?
It's an interesting one because it's one of the only committees I've seen in recent times in the space sector to really delve into it. They did public hearings, for those who aren't necessarily familiar with it, across the country. They rotated around different different states to really talk to industry and see what they think. Unfortunately, with the Barnaby Joyce was the chair of the committee and then being appointed to Deputy Prime Minister earlier in the year, it really slowed the process down. So the committee had no chair for about 3 months. And since then, we just haven't really heard much. There was closing public hearings about a month and a half ago. So we hope if there's something by the end of the year, but noting that the parliamentary session for this year probably ends very soon. I can't imagine anything probably before February, which is disappointing. But it will be interesting to see what they come out. There was a lot of very pointed questions about what regulation is bad, what is good. Barnaby Joyce was very animated when he said, "Why are New Zealand doing things better than we are? We should be doing it better than them." So we can cross our fingers as industry participants and go, something has to happen. It's just a matter of how much emphasis is put on it and the priorities of government at the time.
Absolutely. I see some hands up, so I'll go back on mute, but I'll have more questions in a moment.
Thanks. Yeah, things were better when Barnaby was in charge is not a sentence that I'm accustomed to.
It's not something I hear I would ever really want to say ever, but it was interesting.
We've got Ian and then Angelique.
Okay, well, am I on? Yes. Okay, my question's a simple one. What space industry? Do we have one in Australia? So we're getting the regulation. I'm just aware of where we went with the solar industry in Australia, where Australia were world leaders in the 1980s, and we produced solar panels and all sorts of things, and now dead.
Yeah, I think it's a very fair comment to make, and one that we run the risk of constantly. So we do have a space industry now. It's building very, very quickly. So here in Adelaide, just down the road from me is where the Australian Space Agency is based, and there's about in the realm of 20 different companies now based in Lot 14, where the Space Agency is, which are working mainly in the space sector and on space interests more generally. So it might be building satellites. That's something we can do here in Australia now. Might be what we call downstream applications. So what do you do with space data when you bring it back to Earth? But as well as launch companies. So there's Southern Launch here in South Australia, Gilmore Space Technology in Queensland, as well as Equatorial Launch Australia, who are based in the Northern Territory. And all these entities are all competing with each other to launch. And there are also others who are building new technologies and new facilities to really take advantage of the space sector. Because for many, it's just about this idea of unlimited potential from the ultimate high ground of what can you do from space? What can we move to space to make more accessible, to make cheaper, to make easier? So we're seeing that building now, but the problem's always going to be is at the end of the day, if industry want to do something and then the regulations don't align, they won't do it or they'll move elsewhere. And that's the risk we face. But I think with the cooperation in defence sectors and those related industries coming out of the AUKUS agreement with the US and the United Kingdom, it would be really great to see that technology and leveraging with those partners really push Australian space businesses into the future.
So apart from regulation, is the government doing anything to support the industry?
So I'm a frequent critic of government in this area, but I will be nice for a moment and go, yes, the creation of the space industry was the Australian Space Agency was a really great step in the right direction. Consolidating regulation together, regulatory authority together, and creating this national point of contact was a good step. And then under that, there are several different grant regimes, as well as funding opportunities and more funding just in the science space, as well as industry focused to really push and develop that industry further. And there's a real emphasis on developing that training and that capability domestically, so we can actually suit the needs of our own domestic industry, as well as encouraging foreign companies to come here to Australia. And state governments are also taking a really leading role in this area. New South Wales is very strong in the investment area around startups and space, as is South Australia. Perth and Melbourne are also really trying hard.
Okay.
Thanks, Angelique.
Hi, Joel. Thanks for a really interesting presentation and really fascinating to have a case study showing how
Is it just me or is that frozen.
No,
Yeah, I lost that too.
Angelique, if you can hear us, you might want to turn off your video and just, or drop your question into chat.
I promise it wasn't me preventing the question from being answered.
It looks bad. Maybe, Thomas, if you've got another question, maybe do that now and see if Angelique comes up with.
No worries, I'll just relocate again. Sorry, it's a very big gloomy where I am at the moment, and I need to replace this this computer. The screen's terrible, and so is the camera. But yeah, so Joel, obviously, I know you've been researching this area now for a good few years. One of the things you did as well, because you touched on this partnership between government and the private sector, and also defence as well. So I believe you worked on the Woomera manual, the Woomera handbook. Is that correct? Has there been any? Obviously, there's been militarization in space since you put that together. Has there been any activity on that front at all, or anything that's developed on that side at all, or is that still just carrying along?
Yeah. So for a bit of context, those who don't know, the Woomera manual is a partnership between the University of Adelaide, Exeter, the University of Exeter in the United Kingdom, and the University of Nebraska-Lincoln in the United States, around developing rules of the road manual style document about war in space. How can war lawfully be conducted in space, and what international legal questions need to be asked and answered. As Thomas said, as a beginning of my PhD and as an undergraduate here at the University of Adelaide, I was involved as providing assistance to academics as we went along. The manual is still going. I believe, unfortunately, my thesis commitments have taken me out of the Woomera manual directly. But it's still happening. It's still going. I think they're very close to international consultation now. So there'll be a point where they reach out to foreign governments, provide the draft, and go, "What are your thoughts? How do we? Does this consider interest properly? Is this aligning with interpretations?" Because academic experts, while they might have insight and really strong views, it's countries that make international law. So they're the ones that really need to be consulted on it. So that phase is coming up, and I think, and also hopeful, that the Woomera manual should be published before the end of next year. But don't hold me to that.
Sadly, it looks like Angelique hasn't been able to rejoin. So we're just about to hit 12:30, so we might just call the session to a close, and hopefully Angelique will be able to catch you and chat about it at some stage. But if everyone here can, sort of join me in thanking Joel and certainly all of the speakers and presentations for today. It's been a fantastic session, and thanks so much for joining it, Drew.
Thank you. Excellent.
Lunch now. There's the Inclusion and Diversity networking session, and we'll all be back at 1:30. So thanks very much.
Thank you.